is my great pleasure to introduce John Tamny. And how many people here have seen Jerry's notes on John's book? We have about 3 or 4 people who've done that. We've got about 15 people here, John. So realize that out of that 15, only 2 have read Jerry Van Sickle's notes. So with that, John, it is my great pleasure to introduce well-known, eminent John Tamny, who is, would you call yourself a libertarian?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And his political philosophy, which I have read from Jerry's notes, is very libertarian. In point of fact, I could have written those notes myself. I could have written your book for you. I guess I would have saved you a lot of work. And I very much enjoyed that. And so without further ado, Mr. Tamny is being reported, and let's give him a round of applause and let him start.
Well, thank you very much. Let me begin by saying how flattered I am to be asked to do this. It is a major privilege to get to present on economic and political ideas to groups like this, particularly a libertarian group. Let's never forget that we are the ultimate ideology because we are about choice, about letting people live as they want, free of the burdens imposed on them by others. And so we're on the right side of history, and let's continue to prove it by getting these ideas out there. So big thanks to all of you for attending. Big thanks to Ralph Schnellbar for reaching out and making this happen. And it's also exciting to present in front of Boulder people because I've spent many Saturdays at Boulder at UC Colorado games over the years, football games, and so what a thrill to be presenting out there. Now, obviously, my topic today is the economics of Donald Trump's presidency, the positives, the negatives, the unknowns. But before I get into this, I think it's important to talk about all the negativity and passion that prevailed leading up to election 2016. So much commentary from Hillary Clinton supporters that if Donald Trump won, it was going to be the end of the United States as we know it. So much commentary from Trump supporters saying that if Hillary Clinton won, it was going to, the U.S. was going to go the way of Venezuela and collapse and all these awful things. I think both sides severely insulted the United States. We've got to remember that if the U.S. has lost a step, particularly if it's lost a step economically, ever had. On our worst day, we outperform the rest of the world, and we've got to remember that. I would add that all this passion speaks to something that libertarians know well. I don't think people hated Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump as much as they hate how deformed the federal government has become. Republicans and Democrats have basically massively increased the power of a constitutionally limited government in ways that we have to worry about who is elected. And there lies the problem. But I would say again, the notion that Clinton or Trump could, as constitutionally limited presidents, could wreck this country insults the country, and it suggests that the U.S. isn't worth saving in the first place. I say the U.S. doesn't need to be saved, but we could be spectacular, particularly if libertarian ideology were to take control or infuse the population better. Now, to make this argument, what I want to first do is travel back in time to the 1970s, because I think it's important to have some perspective on where we are today. Now, thinking about the 70s, I'll ask a few rhetorical questions. I can't see you, but how many of you own cell phones? I think I know the answer. What's important about that is that in the 1970s, mobile phones didn't exist. If you wanted to make a call, it was on a landline that you plugged into a wall. And if you wanted to own that landline, it was illegal. You had to rent it from the government's preferred monopoly, at which point if you wanted to make a call from Boulder to Denver, it was a very expensive one. I assume all of you have been on airplanes before. What's interesting there is that in the 70s, commercial air travel was planned Soviet Union style by the Civil Aeronautics Board in Washington, D.C. So major barriers to entry into the airline space back in the 70s. And back then it wasn't uncommon to be asked, have you ever flown before? It was a rare luxury. Nowadays it's something that we do for work quite a bit. All of us probably go away on weekends all the time just to see friends. If we had traveled like this in the 70s, people would have referred to us as very rich and jet set. Some of you, I don't know the age of the audience, but some of you may remember long gas lines in the 1970s. What I want to stress there is that never in the history of mankind have oil and gasoline ever been cheap or expensive. But back in the 70s, much like the 2000s, the U.S. Treasury severely devalued the dollar in which both are priced, and so they soared in nominal terms. And in Southern California, where I grew up, it was quite literally illegal at times to get in line to buy gas on an even day if your license plate ended in an odd number, at which point you could go on a legal day and frequently wait hours hoping that there'd be gas to pump. And then taxation. The top tax rate in the 70s was 70%. What's interesting there is that both political parties supported that rate. George H.W. Bush ran in the Republican primaries back in 1980, and he said if we reduce that rate, it would cause an inflationary breakout. Jimmy Carter agreed with him. I mention this because if you were for tax cuts in the 70s, you were an oddball. Arthur Laffer famously was, and he was an outcast in the economics profession. No less than Alan Greenspan said about him, quote, "I don't know anyone who takes his ideas seriously," end quote. And so I bring all this up to make you hopefully optimistic. We got really stupid in the 1970s, much dumber than we've ever gotten in modern times, and it showed up in much slower economic growth, reduced freedom, all the things that are negatives. But we turned things around. We certainly did in the 80s and 90s, and that's what my first book that Jerry is talking about is about. It argues that economic growth is easy, that nothing could be simpler than economic growth. It's as basic as removing or reducing the four main governmental barriers to production. In the book, I describe them through movies and sports and television and famous people. And I do so for two reasons. For one, it's a middle finger to the economics profession, which I think is utterly worthless. But I also do this because I want people who have no understanding in economics and who are intimidated by it to realize that if they can observe the world around them, they'll know that all that they'll ever need to know about why people prosper. And so what are the four basic? Well, the first one is taxation. Taxes are nothing more than a price or a penalty placed on work. And so in an ideal world, the top income tax rate would be very, very low. You don't want to penalize people for working. Within taxation, there's the capital gains tax. That is a penalty. There are no companies and no jobs without investment first. And so in an ideal world, this rate would be zero. Why would we penalize people for saving and investing? And the third tax, this is something that goes over the heads of nearly every economist on earth, is government spending itself. Governments have no resources. That's not some slogan meant to appeal to the libertarians in this audience as much as it's fact. Governments can only spend what they've taxed or borrowed from the real economy first. And so when they spend, it amounts to Paul Ryan and Nancy Pelosi allocating the economy's precious resources rather than Bill Gates, John Anschutz, John Malone, talented people. And so as a result, it's a big tax on freedom and growth. The next barrier, regulations do not work and they cannot work. If anyone doubts this, all we need to do is go back to 2008 and look at the banking sector. It's easily the most regulated in the U.S., yet those charged with policing the banks didn't have a clue about the troubles brewing within them. The obvious problem with regulations is while they do not work, they force businesses to spend all sorts of time and energy and resources complying with these rules rather than creating profits and innovations for shareholders. Getting right to the point, to believe that regulation works, you have to believe that those who could not get jobs in energy, pharmaceuticals, finance, banking, medicine, and any other regulated industry, those who couldn't get jobs can somehow police those who could. To make it even more ridiculous, to believe that regulation works, you'd have to believe that the Colorado Buffaloes, as good as they're getting under Mike McIntyre, could regularly beat the Denver Broncos in football. But we know that couldn't happen. Nothing against Boulder, but the Broncos have more talent. And that's what, with regulation, we're asking the untalented to police the talented. It always fails. The third main barrier to production and prosperity is floating money values. Let's be clear about what I'm holding in my hands. This is not wealth. If you burned up every dollar in the world today, if Treasury vaporized every dollar, the U.S. would still be the richest country in the world tomorrow. We are the wealth. We are the producers of the goods and services that constitute wealth. Money is just a measure that facilitates the exchange. I've got bread, Ralph has wine. Money is how I can get Ralph's wine even if he doesn't want my bread. It just allows us to exchange the real wealth we're producing. So when it's floating around in value, trade, which is the purpose of all work, is less likely to happen, and so is investment less likely to happen, and we all suffer commensurately. Which brings us to the final barrier, and this is tariffs on foreign goods directed toward the U.S. Now, thinking about trade, why do we get up and go to work every day? We do that to get what we don't have. And so from there, it's fairly, our work is what we exchange for all that we need. And so from that, we can see that free trade benefits everyone in the economy. This notion that it hurts some is laughable. Everyone benefits from having people, not just in their city, state, or country, but people around the world fighting every day to serve their needs, fighting to give them a bargain, thus expanding the value of their paycheck. But even that doesn't get to the true beauty of free trade. What makes it unrelentingly spectacular is that it maximizes the possibility that we as individuals will get to do the work that most animates our individual talents. Now, everyone that I'm speaking to today is good at something or very good at something, probably a lot of things. And so we all know what it's like to do that which elevates our skills. It's no longer work. We can spend hours and hours, we can spend weekends, because it's something that's constantly reinforcing us. And that's why rich countries tend to be free trading nations. Odds are greatest that people are doing the kind of work that most elevates their skills, and they're much more productive as a result. And so there you have the four basic barriers to prosperity. To bring even more clarity to it, I'll add a quote from Henry Hazlitt's essential book, Economics in One Lesson. In it he wrote, quote, "What is harmful or disastrous to an individual must be equally harmful or disastrous to the collection of individuals that make up a nation." What Hazlitt said was very basic, but I would argue it's wildly profound, arguably the most important statement ever written in any economics book. He was saying that an economy is not a living, breathing blob. It's not something you can touch. It's just a collection of individuals. And when you break the economy down, it's so blindingly simple. Because whatever your ideology, no individual is enhanced or made better off if more and more of your work is being taxed away by the federal government or state governments. No individual is able to create more wealth in goods and services if more and more working hours are spent complying with regulations. No individual is able to store and save more wealth if the dollar being earned is constantly being devalued by the U.S. Treasury. And no individual is able to attain more wealth if talented people around the world are barred from serving that individual's needs solely because they live in another country. And so economic growth is basic, and it's an important basis for discussion for what we're going to get to. But before we can get to Trump, I think it's essential to go back further in time to the 1920s and 1930s. I don't think there's any reasonable way to understand the passion behind this most recent election until we know what happened long ago. Well, in 1920 and 21, the U.S. economy fell into a major recession, much bigger than 29 and 30. But the reason you never hear about this recession is because it was so short. And it was so short precisely because the federal government's response was less than nothing. Contrary to popular opinion today, which says governments must spend with abandon during times of economic hardship, back then federal spending was slashed from $6.4 billion in 1920 all the way to $3.3 billion in 1923. This was textbook perfect economics. Governments have no resources, so when the economy's weak, they must pull back so that they can leave as much in the way of resources in the private sector where they can be directed to higher uses. Also contrary to popular opinion today, which says governments must devalue the currency during times of hardship, Back then, the dollar's integrity as 1/20th of an ounce of gold was maintained. This too is an essential. We know that there aren't any companies without jobs. Well, there aren't any companies without investors. When investors invest, they are buying dollars in the future. So the last thing you want to do is to devalue the currency, which scares away the very investors necessary for a rebound. So the federal government having done less than nothing in response to a major recession, the U.S. economy rebounded massively. Unemployment sat at 11.3% in 1920. It fell all the way to 1.7% in 1923, on the way to what we now know as the Roaring Twenties. And so if there's one thing I hope you'll take from my talk today, maybe above anything else, it's this: painful, dispiriting, soul-crushing, and anxiety-inducing as recessions are, they are in fact beautiful. Recessions signal an economy that's about to boom, simply because recessions signal an economy cleansing itself of all the misuses of labor, all the bad habits developed, all the lousy companies being invested in, and all the bad investments in lousy companies, all that being cleansed so that the economy can rebound. And that's why when recessions are untouched, the result is always a major economic boom, because the recession is the cure. To fight recessions, as governments are wont to do, is to fight the recovery. Which brings us to 1929 and 30. The U.S. economy fell into a recession then, no big deal. The difference this time was that Presidents Hoover and Roosevelt decided to conduct a grand experiment on the American people. They were going to shield them from the near-term pain of recessions. In doing so, they created what we now know as the Great Depression. Now, I'll describe their mistakes together, or in tandem. The first one is government spending. In response to the downturn, Hoover and Congress got together and doubled government spending. And then once FDR got into office, spending was put at an even higher level. This failed, and it failed for obvious reasons. To believe that spending is stimulative is the equivalent of believing that those of you in the restaurant on the left side could go to those on the right side, steal $50 of each of you from on the right side, and go out and stimulate Boulder's economy. Well, the obvious problem is that those of you on the right taken from would be commensurately depressed by $50. Furthermore, we've got to remember that government spending is just a shift of wealth from one set of hands to another. No production is involved here. Government spending at best rewards indolence, all the while penalizing enterprise. And then we can't get beyond the basic truth that Paul Ryan and Nancy Pelosi cannot allocate resources as well as someone like Jeff Bezos. So it slows things down. On the taxation front, Hoover and Congress got together and raised the top rate from 25 all the way to 62%. FDR then raised the rate with Congress all the way to 83%. This matters because in any economy, anywhere in the world, we're always and everywhere reliant on the vital few. The risk takers, the innovators, yes, the much demonized 1%ers willing to take risks on new ideas that will employ us, make us more efficient, make us healthier, happier, you name it. Bill Gateses of the world. Well, in the 1930s, the talented were basically told that if you take a risk and succeed, you better have a good accountant because you are going to have a lot of your gains taxed away. On the regulation front, we've got to remember that in the 1930s, the U.S. economy was still about half and half, farm and then other things. Well, so the Agricultural Adjustment Act was a regulation that basically tried to have the federal government retake control of half of the U.S. economy. And then you consider all of the impositions that Hoover and Roosevelt put on businesses, basically implicit regulations that you cannot lower wages to reflect new economic realities. The problem there is labor is a price like any other, and when you don't allow the price to adjust, people go unemployed. And that's what happened. The price of labor wasn't allowed to adjust downward, and so a lot of people were needlessly kept on the sideline by the government intervention. Which brings us to trade. In 1930, Hoover signed into law the Smoot-Hawley Tariff. This placed taxes on over 20,000 foreign goods that were bound for the United States. Now, in response to Smoot-Hawley, J.P. Morgan senior partner Thomas Lamont remarked, quote, "I almost went down on my knees to beg Hoover to veto the asinine Smoot-Hawley tariff, end quote. GM's European head, Graham Howard, sent a telegram to Washington saying, quote, passage of Smoot-Hawley will lead to the most severe depression ever experienced, end quote. If you want to crash an economy, one of the quickest ways to do it is to put up barriers to foreign goods. And the first reason's obvious. If foreigners can't sell to us, they also can't buy from us. So with the stroke of a pen, Hoover massively shrank global markets that U.S. companies had previously been selling into. After that, we can't forget the basic truth that free trade is this beautiful process that allows us to more and more specialize. Let's look at me. I consider myself a writer and an editor. That's what I think I do best. I think that's what elevates me the most. But imagine if barriers to trade forced me to spend more time making the computer on which I type, making the clothes that I wear, raising the food that I eat, building the apartment that I live in. I can say in my case that if I had to do those things, I would die an unfed, unclothed, unemployed, and unsheltered death. But thanks to free trade, I don't have to worry about what I'm not good at producing. I can exchange what I do best with others who are doing what they do best. Barriers to trade are all about forcing people into work that elevates their skills less. And you apply that to companies, barriers to trade invariably prop up the weakest companies at the expense of the most productive. Let's think about something basic like Apple. Apple would never want major barriers to foreign goods simply because it wants to sell into global markets. Which brings us to the dollar. For a business to expand, it must attract investment. But in 1933, and quite literally his first act in office, FDR devalued the dollar from 1/20th of an ounce of gold to 1/35th of an ounce. This sent a chilling message to the investors necessary for a rebound that if they put their capital to work and were actually lucky enough to get a return, their reward was going to be severely devalued dollars. And maybe the most economically crippling of all was the undistributed profits tax of 1936. With this, businesses were taxed at rates up to 74% on any earnings they retained. So if you were GM, GE, RCA, or Ford, four major U.S. companies at the time, and you had the temerity to retain some of your earnings with a future factory, future hiring, future R&D spending in mind, government lay in wait to take that from you and redistribute it. Probably the best way to look at it is to consider Ford Motor Company. It was incorporated in 1903, but it's not as though cars just started rolling off the assembly line the first day. Henry Ford was able to perfect the manufacture of cars through feverish reinvestment of his limited profits back into the business. But imagine if he'd started Ford in 1935. Odds are good that it doesn't become the great global brand that it did simply because he wouldn't have been able to retain the earnings necessary to grow his business. So when you think about the Great Depression, there's no mystery about what happened. It wasn't caused by capitalism. It was caused by a rush away from capitalism. We violated the four basics. Taxes went through the roof, so did regulations. Trade was made less free, and the dollar was devalued. After that, we forgot the essential lesson of the 1920s that recessions are healthy. They signal the boom on the way. Instead, we fought it, and in doing so, we elongated what should have been very short. Now you're probably, or some of you are probably wondering at this point, what does all this have to do with election 2016 and Donald Trump? To me, it has everything to do with it. In the 1930s, Republicans and Democrats alike trampled on the Constitution. Before the 1930s, you realistically did not have to worry about who was president. Most legislation occurred in the cities and states. The president wasn't as consequential. But with the 1930s, Congress and the president became very consequential because they heralded from Washington trying to do everything. And that brings us back to Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. Did people hate them as much as they were terrified at the idea of being ruled by either one? In 1920, it wouldn't have mattered as much, but because government has grown at the federal level beyond what the founders ever intended, and in a full trampling of the Constitution, we must worry. And so the question then becomes, what would Hillary Clinton and or Trump have meant for the U.S. economy? Well, we'll go briefly through Hillary Clinton's ideas. She was for higher taxes on the rich, raising the top rate above 39%, damaging on its own. And she also very much wanted to raise the capital gains rate. Her idea there was that, as she put it, quote, "I want to rein in capitalism's excesses," end quote. But what she missed in all this is that it's capitalistic excess that has made the United States the envy of the world. You go back 100 years to the dawn of the automobile, over 2,000 car makers were incorporated in the United States. 99% of them failed. Most of them were the industrial wreck the Midwest. No, Detroit back then was the Silicon Valley of its day. Failure breeds perfection because we're constantly learning from what doesn't work. Hillary Clinton's idea was to rein in the very excess that's made us so prosperous. She also saw the internet bust in 2001. What she missed is that was a sign of immense economic health. Silicon Valley kills its darlings as the industrial Midwest once did. This is what makes us so prosperous because, again, failure is what breeds progress. On the regulatory front, Clinton wanted to, again, rein in capitalism, rein in all this feverish investment on Wall Street that makes us the envy of the world. On the trade front, she made it clear that she was, quote, not going to burden the American people with more trade agreements, when in fact, anything that opens up trade enhances the lot of every American worker. And of course, presidents get the dollar they want. There's this myth that the Fed controls the value of the dollar. No, the dollar is a political concept. Presidents that go against free trade also generally get a weaker dollar, and that would have reduced investment in new ideas and slowed the economy. So when you look at this, Hillary Clinton failed the four basics impressively. But I leave you with this one thing on Hillary. And this is what I would frequently ask people in our world. She was supported by some of the richest, most talented, most enterprising people on earth. Does anyone really think that they were supporting her based on the idea that once in office she would neuter them? My sense, and we'll never know, thank goodness, is that Hillary Clinton had a lot more bark than she actually had bite. But again, we'll not know. Which brings us to Donald Trump. On taxes, he's largely good. He wants to reduce the top rate from 39 to roughly 33%. Good. Capital gains rate should be 0, but he has proposed reducing it to 15%. The corporate tax, he's proposed reducing it to 25%. The corporate tax should be 0, but I think people overrate the economic implications of it either way. Arguably most bullish of all beyond the income tax cuts is that Trump wants to reduce the estate tax to 0. This is huge. We can't forget that the inherited wealth is some of the most crucial wealth of all for economic growth, simply because by virtue of it being inherited, it's abundant and people have lots they're willing to lose. The average American can only invest in established companies. Nothing wrong with that. That's called wealth preservation. But economic growth is driven by surprise. It's driven by new ideas. And so you look at ESPN, it nearly died, but for an investment from the Getty Oil Trust. The Gettys had $10 million that they were willing to lose, and they most likely would have on ESPN. ESPN was the rare success. Thomas Edison was made possible. His odd light bulb contraption was made possible by a banking error in J.P. Morgan. His father thought he was nuts. Howard Hughes' inheritance made the growth of U.S. aviation possible. Silicon Valley, the original VCs, were backed by Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, Phipps, families so rich that they had money to lose on businesses that generally go bankrupt. And so the estate tax going to 0 is big, big time. On the regulatory front, Trump's rhetoric and seemingly his actions since in office are all about deregulation, another big positive. Regulation achieves less than nothing. But then we get to trade, and it becomes horrifying. What Trump doesn't know about free trade could fill many books. He actually believes that the beautiful process whereby the Japanese, Chinese, Mexicans, Canadians direct so much of their production toward the United States is a sign of the U.S. being gypped, being taken advantage of. He couldn't be more incorrect. The fact that we are the #1 export market in the world is the surest sign that the American people are the most productive people on earth. It's poor countries that don't attract imports. Furthermore, we can't get beyond the basic truth that free trade is the ultimate foreign policy. When countries are trading together, they're less likely to go to war with one another because they have a rooting interest in the success of the other country. As Joseph P. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's father once told him, war is bad for business, and he was right. And then that brings us to the dollar. Trump, despite all evidence going back to Pericles, believes that devaluation is the path to prosperity. There is no evidence that this has ever worked in the history of humankind, but he believes it. And there lies the problem with his views on trade. If he takes them to their logical conclusion, this will show up in a much weaker dollar that will devalue all of our earnings and also reduce the investment that is necessary for economic growth. And so with Trump, it's very interesting. On taxes and regulations, he's very good overall. On trade in the dollar, he's very bad. And this is what we don't know. What I will make clear is that if Trump pursues protectionism in a major fashion, and this shows up in a weaker dollar, as it logically would, the damage from both those mistakes will very severely suffocate any good that comes from tax cuts and deregulation. Trump is playing with matches when he talks about the dollar the way he has, and when he talks about protectionism. It will wreck his presidency. But what I hope and what makes me optimistic is that he seems to be somewhat moving away from it. I think reality has kind of mugged him. Never get. Notice how Peter Navarro, the head of his National Trade Council, has largely disappeared. Reality is catching him on trade, and I think that's showing up in a dollar that has not been in free fall. My honest hope when I hear about the failure of Obamacare repeal, I love all this stuff simply because if Trump can be this distracted for 4 years, not getting anything done of a legislative variety, he is going to have a very successful presidency. What should worry us is that if he has lots of legislative successes, that's when we'll know that he's failing. Stay distracted, and we've got a lot to look forward to. The more I watch what the media views as a train wreck, I think he's going to have a successful presidency precisely because he has no ideology, and because he doesn't, thank goodness he can't get anything done. And so I'll leave it there. Thank you.
For those who are new here, yes. For those who are new here, I ask that you raise your hand. I'll write your name on a list. Very often what happens is that we'll get stacked 8 deep. So we're going to start with this gentleman here, and you're not going to be on webcam, and then we're going to go to Nick.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. In general, I agree with you. However, I don't think Donald Trump is nearly as benign as you say he is. We're running currently at 52% of everybody's paycheck being seized by taxes, federal, state, local, etc. And he has had no progress in reducing those. If you look at his appointments, they're all Goldman Sachs establishment types and foreign policy hawks. We're still bombing 7 countries with no declaration of war. So I think he has already shown that he is not going to do anything needed to be done to make us a more libertarian country.
Did you hear that?
I sure did, and let me be clear, I agree with all of your points. I think it's dangerous, this view that we have troops around the world in the first place. Even much exponentially more dangerous that, as you say, we're bombing countries where there's no declaration of war. I don't get why we're in these countries in the first place. Perfect world, yeah, we would cut them substantially. The very notion of taxes to me I find offensive. It indicates that somehow the federal government should be able to take a percentage of what we earn. But what I will say is that while we see a headline number of 52%, and let me be clear, I don't like the way this is. Taxes should be lower because of all the loopholes, and I prefer a much simplified tax system without them. That number is brought down, and the main thing is a President Trump who can't even cut taxes, and I hope that's the one thing Republicans get done, is also a President Trump who can't achieve trade legislation, who can't achieve legislation that would make a bad situation like Obamacare even worse. And so I hear you. But look throughout history, it's the presidents generally who achieve a lot legislatively who make us worse off. While Trump is far from benign, I think presidents in general who can't get anything done, who are distracted, are better than the ones who get a lot done, a la LBJ.
We have on the list Nick, myself, the gentleman who spoke before, and then Scott. Anybody else wish to speak? Okay. It is Nick's turn.
Hi, John.
Hey,
There's been a crazily long stretch, nearly 20 years in length, of artificially low interest rates designed through political manipulation to prime the pump of the economy. The well is sadly dry. What will happen to the economy during Trump's administration when the Federal Reserve raises to 2% or 3% or 5% or whatever the real market interest rate should be?
well, I think people vastly overstate the Fed's power in the first place, certainly its power over the economy. Let's be clear that the Fed deals with banks. That's how it presumes to channel its economic influence. Banks currently represent 15% of total credit in the U.S. economy, and that number's in free fall. And it is because market forces have worked around banks. Banks are an irrelevant source of credit, and they're increasing in their irrelevance simply because they're so overregulated they can't be competitive in this world. And so people talk about the Fed's zero rate or 0.5, whatever it is. But that's not a manipulation of market rates, and let me explain. Look at Hollywood. Brian Grazer is easily the most talented movie producer in the history of the industry. We're talking Parenthood, Splash, Beautiful Mind, Apollo 13, television shows like Arrested Development, 24, you name it. He's got the ultimate track record. But as he says, my attempts to attain credit to fund my projects fail 90% of the time. Let's look at Silicon Valley. Is credit easy in Silicon Valley? That's what we hear in the media. Oh yeah, if you've got a startup, people will throw money at you. Well, in fact, credit's incredibly expensive out there. And we know that simply because if you want to do a startup, you'll first give up a big portion of your business to a venture capitalist, and then you'll give up even more of it in the form of stock options to lure potential employees. Investment banking, now I'm one of these people, I love Wall Street. I don't like bailouts, but I love Wall Street. It's one thing to come up with a business idea, it's quite another to find financing for it. Is credit easy on Wall Street? No, and we know this because investment bankers are paid enormously well, and they are because in the real world, credit's very expensive. Michael Milken, many of you remember his name. Michael Milken got rich precisely because the Fed can't dictate interest rates or dictate easy credit on its very best day. He got rich with a high yield bond because the vast majority, we're talking 99% of businesses, never rated government credit or bank credit in the first place. Donald Trump, remember back in the 80s, he was the big time real estate guru? Well, in my book on the Fed, I tell the story about how he came to Los Angeles in 1990, wanted to borrow $50 million from Security Pacific Bank, then the fifth largest bank, to fund a new development idea he had out in L.A. Security Pacific Bank didn't like his balance sheet at all, loaned him $10 million, lived to regret it because he didn't pay back the loan at all. They wrote it down 2 years ago. And Trump, it's well known that U.S. banks didn't touch him in the last 10, 20, 30 years. And so this notion of Fed easy credit, that's something for academics and economists. In the real world, credit's always expensive. But what does the Fed manipulate? Okay, government can borrow easily. Yeah, well, the federal government can borrow easily because it's backed by the most productive people on earth. But in the real economy, credit's always expensive, and that's good. If the Fed were a fraction of as powerful as is commonly assumed, the U.S. wouldn't be the richest country on earth. And so my broad point is, this notion of easy Fed credit the Fed's manipulated is belied by everyday realities. I will not defend the Fed. I think we should abolish what makes no sense, what serves no useful purpose. But the Fed's role in the economy is vastly overrated. It's a legend in its own mind.
It's Ralph, this gentleman over here, and then Scott. Would you speak to the aphorism, the little cute statement made in some newspaper back in the 1930s, I believe it was, A switch in time saves 9. Do you remember that?
I do, but I can't remember the context. What do you mean?
U.S. Supreme Court. The story. Anybody here know that story?
They stopped enforcing the Constitution and started caving in to FDR, so he did not pack the court. They stayed with 9 members, but now it was voting 5-4 to toss out the Constitution.
Okay, yeah. Well, here's how I'll speak to it. I think probably many of you know the story better than I, but I'm always confused or bothered when conservatives say we don't want activist judges. I say, wait a second, I want activist judges ruling unconstitutional, all sorts of activity taking place from the federal government. I also want activist judges actively securing my rights from governments that are trying to tell me what to do. If the question is the Supreme Court problematic, that's not my area. I don't write about it a lot, but I think it's unfortunate in modern times that somehow the 9th and 10th Amendments have been forgotten. I think the 9th Amendment was arguably the most important, that basically said whatever's listed here should not be construed as the limits to our rights. As a human being, I feel like I've got unlimited vote away from me. And I also like the idea of states being laboratories of ideas. If states were still laboratories of ideas, we wouldn't have to worry about Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump or Gary Johnson being elected. We could basically live under whomever is our governor or our mayor, and the federal government would do very little. So I think it is crucial. My next book is titled The End of Laziness, but the one I'm writing right now is called They're Both Wrong. And it makes the basic point about how precisely because government's grown so much, we have to fear each party. And so I go chapter by chapter to show just how wrong liberals and conservatives are on just about every policy issue, making the argument this is why we've got to return power to the states so that not everyone has to suffer the inevitable policy mistakes that come from each party.
It's this gentleman, then Scott, and then myself, and then Nick. Or actually, Nick will come before
The
myself.
tax bite of 52% is after all loopholes, so it's worse than you might have thought. Secondly, FDR ran as a libertarian. There's a 1935 book that describes his running in one direction, and as soon as he was sworn in, he went in the opposite direction. He ran against Hoover as a socialist and promised to reduce the federal workforce by 25%, and then he tossed it all out and lied to us and lied to us and lied to us. Finally, J.P. Morgan was not investing his own money. He was investing Rothschild money, which was printed up in the Bank of England, and nothing was given in exchange. So that was all financial manipulation, just as Trump has been sponsored by the Meyer-Lansky organized crime gang and is not at all a successful entrepreneur.
Well, I don't know what to tell you on J.P. Morgan other than the history I read, whether it came from his own or his father's or the Rothschilds. We're talking about big fortunes either way, and it was directed toward Thomas Edison. I think that's generally a good thing, and I think the history of inherited wealth is a fairly intriguing one for frequently reaching people, entrepreneurs who otherwise would have gone without. As far as FDR, what do you want me to say? Politicians are bad. People who run for office generally don't have the best interest in mind or the best interest in mind of freedom, and so we've got to watch them like hawks. It goes back to the basic point that I think we all want, is government to be more local so that mistakes made in one place don't infect everyone. As far as the tax rate, you know, we're just going to have to agree to disagree. I'm sure you can point to people who pay 52%. I know people who would say the same as you, but anecdote is not fact. In most instances, the Congress will raise the top rate to a certain level precisely because it then gives it a chance to reduce that rate to a lower level through all sorts of favors. One example is the corporate tax rate. Let me be clear. I think the corporate tax rate should be 0. Corporations are owned by individuals, and as such, the corporate tax amounts to a double tax on individual earnings. At the same time, when conservatives go around screaming that it's the highest rate in the world at 35%, that's laughable. And we know that simply because the most valuable companies in the world by far are generally located in the United States. If in fact they were all paying 35%, government revenues from that tax would be much higher than $300 billion. And so I can say to you, my headline rate of taxation is well into the 30s, but the rate of taxation that I pay, my effective rate, is 21%. Now again, I'm just one individual, and I'm not defending the taxation, but history is fairly clear. Back when the top rate was 91%, few people were paying that rate. Again, I'm not defending it, but there are always ways around it.
We have Scott, Nick, then Ralph.
As a South Park libertarian, I wanted to add the aphorism that I used for what you started with in terms of the president, and that is that the problem is government, not who's president. That's my shortened aphorism for what you said so well. My other question is that I'm wondering what you think of the idea that I think is going to happen, is that we are going to hit a black swan, a major depression, a major collapse, and Trump will be blamed for it, regardless of what what actually caused it. And I think the response is going to be more of what you said, is an attempt to fix the recession or whatever, rather than solve problems by a recession. So I'm wondering what you think of that possibility.
Well, good question. As far as the aphorism, yes. The problem is government. It's just fascinating me watching this debate over Obamacare. Conservatives just went nuts yesterday. Oh my gosh, what's going to happen now that Republicans couldn't repeal it? What does this do for the Republican Party and everything? And my response is, implicit there is that before Obamacare, that healthcare was some dynamic free market concept. Well, what a laugh. And so even if you did repeal it, what was that going to do for you? It's going to create this perception that we were going to have nirvana ahead. No, we were going to still have the same loser system that we had before. And it's not an awful system, but basically, why is healthcare, quote, somewhat scarce? It is precisely because Republicans and Democrats keep trying to legislate access to what is a market good. Well, you cannot do that. And if you try to do it, as a rule, you're going to fail. I mean, you think back to 1990, I thought retail was pretty great until Jeff Bezos made me realize, wait, I can order all this stuff online. Well, that's pretty great, but now Bezos is talking about delivering it to me via drones. And we have Congress talking about building more roads, when people like Bezos are figuring out other ways for us to get what we need. And so for Congress to try to legislate access to health care, there is the problem. The problem is always government. Health care is the easy part. If they weren't legislating access to it, we don't think about why we have supercomputers in our pockets in the form of cell phones. We have them because of feverish reinvestment and failure that leads to perfection and constant improvement on that perfection. We would have the same with healthcare if government just were doing nothing. So that's the first thing. As far as whether there's a Great Depression ahead, let's be clear there that, well, I mean, if you're right, you should go out and raise a lot of money because you will make billions of dollars on the downturn. It's very hard to call what is ahead, and those who can do it, most players of Wall Street would freely admit that they're wrong nearly as often as they're right, and that's the very good ones. And so, okay, maybe you're right, but I would submit to you that you'd only have a crisis if there's intervention. There was no financial crisis back in 2008. Gosh, banks have failed before. The idea that the failure of Citi, a bank that's been bailed out 5 times in 25 years, was going to set us back for decades, as Ben Bernanke asserted, was laughable. You look at Japan and Germany, they were literally leveled during World War II, but once the war ended, they roared back very quickly. The idea that a bank failure could cause a crisis defies basic common sense. The crisis in 08 was intervention by the Bush administration. And it was intervention by the Fed with the Bush administration's assent. If you don't have that, there's no crisis, and you have a very quick snapback. And so there's only going to be a, quote, crisis this time if, when what's healthy, businesses fail all the time, if government intervenes. Now, there you may have a point. Donald Trump may be the type, this administration may be the type, okay, it's got Wall Street people and everything. I don't think Wall Street's inherently bad, but maybe they would have the incentive to save that which they shouldn't. That would be the crisis. It's never a crisis when an economy slows down or when a business fails. That's a sign of health. And so I think we need to define our terms. The idea that you can predict a major Great Depression, what you're saying there is you're predicting something healthy to happen, at which point government's going to intervene. And that may be true, but we'll see.
The list is Nick, Ralph, Heidi. Anybody else have their hand up? That's what we got so far. Nick.
So John, very minor bone to pick with you on your statement that governments have no resources and lots of real property, buildings they use to administer their defense. You have things like aircraft carriers, military forces, and all sorts of other stuff. So in that sense,
Yeah, I can hear you.
in that sense, I do believe the government has resources that it did arrive at through the taxation of income and the like from prior times. My real statement is this. You stated that tariffs are naturally bad for the economy. And I ask you this, if tariffs are so bad for your economy, how come the economy of the People's Republic of China just shows year after year strength and growth when they apply every kind of tariff and bizarre block on American goods that are coming in?
Okay, yeah, the first thing, okay, but when you say that government has resources, you're just proving my point. Yeah, it's got resources that it takes from the private sector, but it has no resources of its own. It's not producing anything. It's commonly said, well, government created the internet. No, it created something that was unworkable thanks to resources from the private sector. Let's remember, all government workers once were not government workers. What government has, the quote, jobs it creates, they're always and everywhere a function of wealth first created in the private sector. If governments had resources, Haiti would be a big government spender. It's not, because its people are not productive. As far as the other one, as far as tariffs, let's just look at that as the seen versus the unseen. Now, I think in a sense you overrate all the barriers to American goods. To visit China is to see American brands everywhere. But again, that's anecdote. But what I would say to you is that one way is that the fact that if, let's say, China had enormously high tariffs, how damaging for its economy. As much as it's grown, think how much more it would be growing. Think how much richer it would be today if it didn't have these barriers that deprive people of their natural drive towards specialization.
Maybe they use this as a method of controlling the growth because they're afraid that growth might lead to unchecked capitalism and a people that demand freedom wither into the communist yoke.
Well, yeah, and look, I hear you, and I don't mean this in a criticizing way. Have you been to China before?
I have not.
And you look at a city like Shanghai, and I've been a couple of times, doesn't make me an expert, that's not my statement, but in 1978, Shanghai quite literally had 15 skyscrapers. 2006, it had 3,780. By today, that number is easily 8,000. You would not believe it. And my point here is that, sorry, that was not government planning. Government planning does not lead to this enormous explosion of wealth. China is much more economically free than people want to admit. And spare me, and I'm not saying you're making the statement, but people love to say, oh, that's an easy central bank. Oh, please. If central banks could create economic growth, well, then Haiti would have one and it would have skyscrapers. China is the recipient of enormous inflows of foreign investment because the people are much more economically free. It is stunning to visit that country and to see how fast it's growing. I realize that there are people there still trying to control it. Lots of luck there. growth is out of the bottle and everything, and it's amazing to watch.
It's Ralph and Heidi. Anybody else have their hand up? This gentleman. Okay. I'm going to continue Nick's question, and believe me, I'm an economist type of person. When Chicago economists actually meant free markets back in the 1980s. Paraphrasing Nick's question, is anything like a bad trade deal?
No. Now, let's be clear. What do we want? I'm ultimately on Ron Paul's side. I don't think trade deals should exist. I think because I'm a human being, I should have the right to freely trade with anyone.
And that's precisely, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be cutting off your point, but that's precisely my point. I believe, without proof, that if I have a deal with you, that unfortunately this government coerced deal with you that says, I must give you $2 for every dollar you give me, that to me, ceteris paribus. If I give you $2 for every dollar you give me, that's a bad trade deal instituted by government. And just like you, and I want to make it very clear, I agree with you that that is not a free trade deal. That is simply a government mandated deal, the ridiculous one that I made. So when Trump says there's a bad trade deal, perhaps he's right. I'd like you to comment on that.
Well, if we're going to look through every trade deal and say, oh, it's bad in the sense that to some degree it's managed. But let's be clear about one thing. The average tariff over all goods coming into the U.S. from foreign countries is 1.4%. It should be zero? Of course it should be. But the broad thing there is that we're in a sense already open to the world's goods and services. We take them duty-free for the most part. That is why, it is a major reason why we are the richest country in the world. After that, these deals that we would rather not have, what they're generally about, mainly because U.S. tariffs are already so low, they're about opening up foreign markets to U.S. producers. Now, again, should the federal government have any role here? No. But sadly, we do not live in a perfect world. Trump's version of this is he's reversing that imports are a sign of us getting gypped, that other countries cheat on trade. Oh my gosh, Bastiat would be spinning. The whole purpose of work is to get. That's why we're doing it. So if countries want to, quote, cheat us by sending us more than we send them, because let's be clear, trade is ultimately about product for products. I want to be cheated like this every day of the week. If other countries want to subsidize our getting, and if they want to be so lame-brained and brain-dead as to put up barriers to our goods, let them do it, because we're still getting. And I will add, I'm for good or bad, I'm in Las Vegas right now. Everywhere I look, I see Chinese people. To the extent that they've got tariffs on our goods over there, they're coming here to buy our stuff. So you can always point to a bad deal. Any trade deal is bad, and the government should have no role there. But overall, look, the U.S. is already open. So in a sense, okay, why not do things that lead to more open markets? It's not ideal, but it's probably better than what we have.
Okay. We have Heidi, and then the gentleman who just sat down. So Heidi, it's your turn to talk.
I just wanted to hear about his website and the books he's written. Can you just tell us about that?
I couldn't hear the question.
Just tell us about your site and the books you've written.
Okay, well, so website, Real Clear Markets. This is basically what I do on a daily basis is I want people who are interested in the markets and economy to be able to come to one place and get a snapshot or a fairly good read of commentary across various publications. And so it's not a libertarian, it's not a liberal, left wing, it's not a conservative, it's not supply side. I basically try to bring a variety of opinion together so that people can basically decide on their own, okay, whom do I agree with, whom do I disagree with. As far as my books, I had briefly touched on the first one. Popular economics is basically my middle finger to the economics profession. How dare they make difficult with charts and graphs and equations what is just so logical, what is a study of human action. And so in popular economics, I explain once again through movies and sports and famous people and businesses why economic growth is so easy. And I just simplify it because economics is simple. The idea that you should have a PhD to do economics is just silly. What a waste of time. And so that's the first one. The one is Who Needs the Fed? It is a very optimistic book. Let me be clear, I despise the Fed. The illogic that accounts for logic inside that institution is laughable. The Fed believes that economic growth causes inflation, among many other ridiculous things. In fact, economic growth is the greatest enemy rising prices have ever known. Economic growth, by its very name, constantly pushes down prices. But the Fed believes otherwise. But my broad point in the book is that there's this notion that the Fed is all powerful and that it centrally plans economic outcomes. Please, look at Hollywood, look at investment banking, look at Silicon Valley, look at our president today. Credit in the real economy, the cost of accessing resources, and that's what you're doing when you're borrowing dollars, you're accessing real resources, very, very hard to get. The idea that the Fed has been able to make it 0% is laughable, and there are so many statistics to prove this point. One of them that I bring in is from the Kauffman Foundation. I describe it in the book, is that they found that of small businesses in 2014 or 15, 53% of them went without credit altogether. Very difficult to get. The Fed is not nearly as powerful. It can't increase money supply. What a laugh. Imagine the Fed trying to do that in Baltimore. It couldn't do any attempt to do it. It would vanish on its best day. We saw with QE, the Fed tried to increase, quote, money supply. The money flowed out of the country. Despite what the Fed tries to do to control the economy, it's not that powerful. I address the notion that it caused the stock market boom and then systematically show how the Fed's QE, if anything, restrained what would have been a much bigger boom. So again, it's a book that says we overstate the power and import of the Fed. It loves that we take it seriously because that maintains its existence. When you think about it, it's not that important. And then I also addressed the notion that the dollar has fallen 93% since the Fed came into being. That's just not a serious presumption. We had devaluations of the dollar long before the Fed, and if you look at the major devaluations in the 20th century, they had nothing to do with the Fed. In fact, the Fed officials were begging the U.S. Treasury and the President in each instance not to do what they do. So it's a way of saying, look, the Fed is ridiculous, but let's move on from this notion that it's all powerful. It quite simply isn't.
We have this gentleman and then Ralph. Anybody else?
Can you tell us again your name and your email address?
Oh, I couldn't hear that question.
Can you tell us again your name and your email address?
Sure. It's my name is John Tamny, and my email is JTA Mary Norma Y, jtamney at realclearmarkets.com. I hope to have my next book out. It's called The End of Laziness in 2018. It's already finished. This book makes the argument that work is evolving in a beautiful way such that more and more people are going to get to pursue work in life that also mirrors their passions, hence the end of laziness. It's already happening, but it's going to happen more and more. So that's the next one.
It's Ralph, and I've got a whole, and then, you know what? Bill, go ahead, and then I've got a whole series of questions.
Well,
And can you hear Bill?
I'll try to talk loudly. The first thing on tariffs is back in, I understand that some of the best growth of the United States was from after the Civil War until the Federal Reserve was created, and that the average tariff was around 40% for those years. So I guess that's the first question. The other one is, now that we're the reserve currency, there's some weird things that happen with our ability to send money out and get goods back without ever actually selling goods ourselves. So I don't see you addressing the reserve currency issue or the history of good tariffs.
On tariffs, as we all know, I think, initially the federal government raised revenues through tariffs. But I think it's worth pointing out that back then there wasn't an income tax, there weren't all these other taxes, so that's probably one factor. But we have to once again consider the unseen. What if we hadn't been taxing exports that much? The growth probably would have been much quicker. But I would also add that I think as libertarians, we need to be clear that we would be for tax cuts even if they led to lower growth. That we would be for no tariffs even if they harm the economy, because we are about individual freedom. And conservatives and supply-siders, the worst about this is they always say, well, look at what our plan did. It led to 3.1 GDP. Well, forget about that GDP is a ridiculous number. We should be for these things because we're about the individual. We're about individual freedom. Now, as far as the reserve currency, I didn't quite hear the second part of the question.
With the reserve currency status, since Bretton Woods, where most countries, in order to export something, they have to get paid. And in order to import something, they use that same money to give it back. So you end up with a balance of payments. So, but with a reserve currency, you've got, I think it was, Triffin's dilemma, it's one of those, where now that everybody treats our currency as a reserve, they will go ahead and accept our money and send us goods, but we don't actually to export back to them. I think that's a reason for tariffs, is that the reserve currency status is distorted, and that's why we're exporting jobs.
Trade is ultimately all about products for products, and so lots of people use dollars around the world to facilitate trade. I don't worry about balance of payments because trade, by definition, balances. I run a quote trade surplus with my employers, and I run a trade deficit with when I had a landlord, my landlord, with the restaurants I patronize. That's the easy part. Money is just the facilitator of it, so I think we overrate the reserve currency aspect of it. What I wish is that the U.S. Treasury were more responsible about it. Imagine what it would mean for the rest of the world if we pursued, which we could, a stable dollar, a dollar that holds its value. It would make trade between countries much simpler because other countries could either adopt and dollarize, or they could peg their currency to the dollar. And we wouldn't have all these whipsaws of economic growth going up and down and everything that is invariably caused by floating money, where it just kind of distorts where capital flows take place and everything. So I would just say that it's a shame that, doing what lots of countries do. It's pegged its currency to the dollar. That's a normal thing. The shame is that the U.S. Treasury, under Republicans and Democrats, have forgotten the crucial importance made. I thought Adam Smith said it best, quote, the sole use of money is to circulate consumable goods. Money is not wealth. It's just a measure that facilitates the trade, which is the purpose of all of our work. We'd be trading and investing a lot more if the dollar were stable. And I hope we can get back to that point. I don't think government's going to do it, but I think more and more competing currencies, private money is going to take the place of the dollar at the time, and that's going to get us back to where we want to be.
John, I need to, for technical reasons, stop this recording. I'm going to stop it for about a half a minute, and then I'm going to start it again. So I'm going to do so, and just I ask you to hang on for a moment.
Okay.
Thank you. I have started the recording, John, and I have a whole list of questions, and I will take anybody who jump in, so I don't want to monopolize this. So my first comment is follows up on something you just said. I find it absolutely astonishing that the Federal Reserve is aiming for a 2% inflation rate. And it's just unhappy that the inflation rate, as it measures it, is down around 1%. Care to comment?
Oh, yeah. How very ridiculous. Assuming its measure of inflation were correct, why on earth would you want to devalue the earnings of people. Why would you want goods and services to be more expensive? Over time, in theory, the price level would double. But let's be clear about something. The Fed's definition of inflation, I think our definition of inflation, is a decline in the value of the currency. The Fed doesn't see inflation that way. It is so diluted and confused. The Fed believes that inflation is caused by too much economic growth. It says too much economic growth leads to labor and goods shortages. How very ridiculous. Because as we see throughout time, the first cell phone cost $4,000. Now we can get it for next to nothing. The first computer cost over $1 million in the 1960s. $200 that are exponentially more powerful. In the real world, that the Fed is not part of, economic growth, because economic growth presumes lots of investment, is all about the prices of everything declining. In terms of labor shortages, the Fed's models not only ignore the fact that, for instance, Boeing builds its 787 Dreamliner in 7 different countries around the world, Apple builds its iPhone around the world, U.S. car makers do the same thing, but the Fed's models also ignore the basic truth that economic growth is all about mitigating labor shortages, because what is progress? It's about getting more for less. The car, the tractor, the computer, Wi-Fi were the biggest job destroyers in history. They didn't put us in breadlines, but they reduced the need for labor in all sorts of ways. And so if you want to avoid labor shortages, the best way is to pursue economic growth, simply because the advances will reduce the need for wasted labor on things that we used to waste labor on. So everything's wrong with the Fed, but this notion that it's all powerful over the economy, please, if these idiots had the, and we know they're idiots, if they had a lot of power, the U.S. economy would be a fraction of where it is.
Ralph, again, unless, oh, Heidi, you want to go? Go ahead, Heidi.
Can you tell us about some contemporary economists that you really admire and others that you think are real idiots?
Could you repeat that?
Can you tell us about some economists, either contemporary or dead, that you really admire, and the ones that you think are idiots?
Well, the ones I admire the most, thankfully, generally weren't economists. Henry Hazlitt, his Economics in One Lesson, something that I read once a year. Adam Smith, oh my gosh, it just could go on forever. John Stuart Mill, one of my favorites. Bastiat, Frederick Bastiat for sure, Jean-Baptiste Say. So most of them are dead. In terms of living economists, Jude Wanniski died at this point about 9 years ago. He was a political economist, more of the but I thought I learned a lot from him. Of actual PhD, it is hard to find them. David Ransom is someone I respect a great deal. But generally, I mean, we are talking about a profession that believes almost to a man and woman that World War II ended the Great Depression. I can't think of a more wrong presumption, but also something more horrifying. The notion that killing your best customers around the world and destroying people, the most important source of wealth in the world, enhanced our economy is just, it's horrible to even think about, but that's what the profession believes. And so if you want to go with that, oh my gosh, Kenneth Rogoff, Paul Krugman, that's shooting fish in a barrel. The number of Greg Mankiw on the right, but he's so wrong-headed on most things. The list is very, very long of really dangerous thinkers out there. Who is Janet Yellen's husband, George Akerlof? If you read the latest book he wrote with Robert Schiller, you'll be sad how ridiculously diluted and disentangled from reality those two are. I have very little respect for the profession.
We have Nick and Ralph. So, Nick, you're up.
John, I've noticed a certain stickiness in wages since the 1980s, just as a personal anecdote. So looking to support that, I got on the internet that kind of confirmed my suspicions that wages haven't really grown much. Wages appear to be the last price that goes up, and the first one to come down when there's an economic downturn. Do you have any feedback for us or any other guidance on this? Is it really happening? Is it my imagination? And if it is happening, tell us why.
Well, the first thing I'll say is, what's the purest market signal on earth? I think it's where people go to. It's the passage of people. If U.S. wages were really sticky, as economists love to tell us, why is the U.S., at least except for the exception of the last 5 years, been the recipient of so many great people from around the world, rich and poor? If wages were sticky, they'd be going elsewhere. So that's the first thing I would say. Secondly, I think those statistics ignore that, well, they're massaged as statistics. Okay, are your wages stuck to where they were in the 1980s? I'm guessing probably not, but if they are, that would be anecdote. Let's look at reality. Google is so desperate to retain employees that it's now building houses for them at below market rates. And let's be clear that it's even bidding on chefs to cook. Starbucks is so desperate to retain employees on the lower end that it's offering not just health insurance and stock options, but free college education. Netflix is offering up to a year of paid leave after your wife has a baby. SunTrust and all sorts of other businesses are offering all manner of ways, personal days that you take off just to work on your finances. All indications are that prosperous businesses keep figuring out ways to raise wages. By the presumption as is, if you look in the real economy, and haven't had as strong of one as we've had in the past, and I'll get to that, companies are constantly competing for wages for employees, which belies this notion of stickiness or flat. Oh, please. We wouldn't be the recipient of so much talent if that were true. But I do think there's something up. In 1971, President Nixon, in his infinite unwisdom, begged, I would add, by the Fed not to do it, delink the dollar from gold. When investors invest, they are once again buying future dollar income streams. Is it any surprise that wages perhaps haven't risen as much as they were after 1973? Is it any surprise that some people would say that innovation, while it's still there, hasn't increased like it has? Well, no. If you're devaluing the dollar, you're making it more likely that people will buy into an inflation hedges, hard assets, things like housing, things like commodities like gold, oil, things that go up when the dollar declines. And so I don't think it's any wages perhaps aren't rising as fast as they could. We've had an unstable dollar during that time. But I would say during the 80s and 90s when the dollar was strong, people were moving from job to job. That signals lots of competition for workers. But look at what the dollar has done since 2001. When Bush got into office in 2001, a dollar bought 1/260th of an ounce of gold. When he left, it was 1/1000th. By August of 2011, under Obama, it was 1/1900th of an ounce. Is it any surprise that investment in new ideas has shrunk? I don't think so. If we had a stronger dollar, we'd have a more stable dollar, we'd be having a different discussion.
Ralph? Okay, I'll go through my questions. I'd like to tell a story about something I heard back in the late 1970s. I've told this story before, but I'll tell it again to our new participants here. I worked for the phone company as an installer back then, and I read somewhere that, and this is back in the this would be 1968 when I was a telephone installer, and the story is that if the number of calls being made in 1968 was handled by telephone operators instead of automated equipment, every man, woman, and child in the United States would be a telephone operator. So the point of this story is that automation really does make things better. And I'm just sort of shocked that so many smart people today are talking about what are we going to do with all the unemployed people due to automation. There was a Rod Sterling story, and I don't remember the name of the show, about that very concept. This is something that happens over and over and over again in history, where people take massive number of people are going to be unemployed. They are unable to overcome frictional unemployment due to technology.
Oh, well, yes. The final chapter of my Fed book, it's titled, Robots Will Be the Biggest Job Creators in History. And of course they will. Why would people be investing in technology that automates things so that they can produce in abundance when everyone's unemployed? The rise of robots itself is the surest sign of massive employment and jobs for everyone in the future. Simply because no one would produce to get nothing in return. And then you look at it, the tractor's arguably the biggest job destroyer in history. Did it put us in bread lines? No, it made farm workers more productive so that more and more people could go on and do other things that more animated their talents. I don't know about any of you, but if I had to work on a farm, I'd be pretty pathetic. And so automation is this beautiful process that frees us of work so that we can constantly go to our next specialization. Just as free trade allows us to specialize, so do robots do the same thing. And I think the other problem with this ridiculous argument that robots are going to impoverish us in unemployment, yet isn't it funny how the most technologically advanced countries are also the richest, is that it's one of these ideas that mistakes credit for money. What are you doing when you borrow money? You're not borrowing dollars, you're borrowing access to resources. Trucks, tractors, computers, desks, chairs, buildings, labor most of all. And so what do robots signal? Robots signal massive production of resources on a scale that we've never seen if they fulfill even a fraction of their promise. What does that mean? It means credit availability, the likes of which we've never seen, which means more entrepreneurs pursuing that which most elevates their skills. The problem with the future, if robots fulfill their promise, won't be a lack of jobs. It will be people deciding which job to take. This argument that they represent a threat is ridiculous. Now, I must say, I've only got time for, I have to go down for a lunch, but I've got time for one more question. I apologize.
I have one more question. Does anybody here have one? Then I will ask my question. And I'll try and be brief as a little introduction. Back in the 1980s, the Fed almost went out of business, as I understand it. I don't know if this is true. This may be apocryphal. Because the growth of the economy just wiped out all U.S. debt. I don't know if you've heard that. Let me ask you, we're in massive amounts of debt right now. I will express my opinion. I think that if the Trump bump continues, as reflected in the stock market, we may be able to get rid of this $20 trillion worth of debt actually fairly shortly, a couple, 3, 4, 5 years. Your expression, your thoughts?
My thought is that, look, this focus on deficits is a waste of time. The focus should be on the level of government spending. Let's ask ourselves a basic question. Would we prefer $1 trillion of spending every year in which $500 billion is deficit, or would we prefer a balanced budget of $4 trillion a year? The answer is obvious. Government can either take it from us or it can borrow from us. To me, it's a distinction without a difference. Either way, it's a tax on growth. Now, in terms of the deficits, okay, we have them. Well, yeah, we're the richest country in the world. I am not defending the deficits. But what was the 10-year yielding back in 1980? 11.5%. At present, the 10-year, and let's be clear, this is not all the Fed. Most foreign debt is held around the world. 10 years now yielding 2.1%. Sorry, that's not a sign of a country in debt trouble. So when people say, oh, we can't afford to do this, or we've got to have entitlement reform, I reject that notion. Not because I support the entitlements, but because markets think this is perfectly okay. The debt markets are plainly not worried about the debt. So to say we're in debt trouble is a way of saying markets are stupid, and I don't think we think markets are stupid. What scares me about entitlement reform, look, I want to get rid of Social Security and all of this. But if we reform Medicare and Social Security, what, do you think Congress is going to suddenly hand us back all those revenues? No. They'll just drink debt. Is that it makes it, because increasingly interest payments on the debt itself takes up more and more in the budget, is it makes it much more difficult for Congress to dream up more ridiculous ideas. And so again, I think markets say that the fear of deficits is totally overdone, but the bigger thing is, even if we reform it, Congress will just dream up new things. I'd rather it be hamstrung by the ridiculous programs that it's already created rather than new ones.
And with that, since you have to run, I want to say you have kept a lot of people here who normally leave after an hour. And I want to say thank you so very, very much for what you've done. I think you deserve a huge round of applause.
Thank you so much. It's so flattering that people would take time to listen to me. Thank you to all of you. Remember, never forget that our ideas are right. We know that. It's all about choice, and we're going to get our, well, who knows if we'll get our way, but we've got to keep trying.
John, you're going to be hearing from me in emails, and I want to let people know that you are going to be invited back, perhaps to in a debate with somebody who does not hold our views. I hope you're open to that, but we'll discuss that by email if that's okay.
Sounds good.
Thank you so much.